Holmes sat in his usual armchair, enveloped in his dressing gown, eyes half closed as he played a somber tune on his violin. Our piece was interrupted by a knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson appeared, ushering in a stout, middle-aged man whose nervous demeanor was betrayed by his darting eyes and twitching fingers. He wore a heavy overcoat, its lapels dusted with snow, and clutched a battered leather satchel. "Mr. Holmes," the man began, his voice trembling, "my name is Harold Phelps, and I have come seeking your expertise. I fear I am in grave danger." Holmes rose with a sharp glint in his eyes, every trace of languor gone. "Pray, be seated, Mr. Phelps, and recount your tale. Spare no detail." "I am a librarian at the British Museum," Phelps began, removing his satchel and placing it on the table. "3 days ago, a strange man came to my office, claiming he was a scholar researching esoteric texts. He demanded access to a rare book in our restricted collection, an ancient manuscript known as the Crimson Codex." Holmes's brow furrowed. The name is familiar. A medieval grimoire, is it not? Supposedly lost for centuries. "Precisely," Phelps said. "The Codex is said to contain secrets of alchemy, forbidden rituals, and knowledge that borders on the occult. Its very existence is shrouded in mystery, but it was unearthed a decade ago and entrusted to the museum for safekeeping." Holmes steepled his fingers. "And now you fear retribution?" Phelps nodded gravely. "Last night, I heard strange noises outside my flat. This morning, I found a note slipped under my door. It read, 'The Codex is not yours to keep. Surrender it, or you will pay the price.'" From his satchel, Phelps produced the note, written in spidery handwriting. Holmes examined it closely, his expression unreadable. "Fascinating. The ink is of an unusual composition, likely homemade, and the paper bears watermarks from a specific stationer on Charing Cross Road." Before Holmes could expound further, Phelps added, "There's more. This morning, when I arrived at the museum, I discovered that someone had broken into the restricted collection. The Codex is missing." This revelation visibly piqued Holmes's interest. "Missing, you say? And the means of entry?" "An iron grate was forced open in the basement," Phelps explained. "The thief avoided the main entrances entirely." Holmes stood abruptly, reaching for his coat and hat. "Watson, fetch your revolver. Mr. Phelps, we shall accompany you to the museum. This case is far too intriguing to delay." Upon arriving at the British Museum, Holmes moved with precision, examining every detail of the basement grate. The metal bars had been bent with extraordinary force, and faint scuff marks led to the restricted collection's door, which had been expertly picked. Inside the collection, Holmes scrutinized the empty glass case where the Crimson Codex had been displayed. He noted faint smudges on the glass and marks on the floor. "Knees," Holmes murmured, pointing to the floor. "The thief paused here, perhaps to examine the Codex before leaving. Look here, Watson, a thin residue." I crouched beside him, observing the faint smear of a reddish substance. "Blood?" I asked. Holmes shook his head. "No, paint. Or more accurately, red lacquer." Returning to the grate, Holmes found a fragment of black fabric caught on the jagged metal. He pocketed it and turned to Phelps. "Was the Codex bound in a distinctive cover?" "Yes," Phelps said. "Its cover is black leather, adorned with a crimson pentagram inlaid with lacquer." "Excellent," Holmes said. "Our thief likely damaged the cover, leaving traces of the lacquer behind. The fragment of fabric suggests their clothing was torn during the escape." Holmes's next destination was the stationer's shop on Charing Cross Road, where the watermarked paper used for the threatening note originated. The shopkeeper, a wiry man with a sharp memory, confirmed selling a sheaf of the paper to a man matching Phelps's description of the irate visitor. "He asked many questions about parchment and inks," the shopkeeper said. "Seemed like an odd fellow. Wore a heavy cloak and kept glancing over his shoulder. "Did he mention a name or address?" Holmes asked. The shopkeeper hesitated. "No name, but he paid with a note from the Bank of Lewisham." The landlord, a stout woman with a sharp tongue, confirmed that a cloaked man had been renting a room for the past fortnight. "Always coming and going at odd hours," she said. "He's upstairs, room 6. We ascended the creaking staircase, Holmes motioning for me to ready my revolver. He knocked sharply on the door. "Mr. Holmes," he announced. "Open up." There was no response, but faint rustling could be heard within. Holmes nodded, and we forced the door open. The room was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of burning wax. On a rickety table lay the Crimson Codex, its pages open and surrounded by half-melted candles. The cloaked man stood by the window, his face pale and gaunt. "You are too late, Mr. Holmes," he hissed. "The secrets of the Codex will be mine." Before we could act, the man began chanting in a language I did not recognize. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier, the flickering candlelight casting eerie shadows on the walls. "You don't understand," he gasped. "The Codex, its power is real. It holds the key to immortality." Holmes ignored him, binding the man's hands with a length of cord. "You are nothing more than a thief and a charlatan," he said. "The Codex will be returned to its rightful place." The Crimson Codex was restored to the British Museum under tighter security, and the thief was handed over to the authorities. As we sat by the fire in our Baker Street rooms that evening, Holmes reflected on the case. "The allure of forbidden knowledge, Watson," he said, "is as old as humanity itself. But the true danger lies not in the knowledge, but in the greed and delusion it inspires." "And the Codex?" I asked. "Do you believe it holds any real power?" Holmes smiled faintly, tapping his fingers together. "That, my dear Watson, is a mystery best left unsolved.